I'm telling you to get your hands where I can see them. Now.
Both hands are visible. On what legal basis are you detaining me?
You're being uncooperative.
Uncooperative is a description, not a crime. What is the specific statute you're operating under right now?
Ma'am, I will not ask you again.
Then don't. But I want you to understand something very clearly. Every single word you say right now is going to matter later. Every word.
Are you threatening me?
I'm informing you. There's a difference. I'd think carefully about which one of us actually needs to be worried right now.
It was 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in Hargrove, and the sprinklers were still running on the lawn across the street. The kind of small, ordinary, completely unbothered thing that the world keeps doing even when something terrible is happening inside it. Water hitting grass. Streetlights doing their quiet job. Someone's porch light on. A neighborhood that looked, from any distance at all, completely fine. Camille Weston-Hayes had been on her feet for 14 hours. She was a trauma surgeon at Hargrove Regional Medical Center, and she had spent those 14 hours doing what she always did, moving fast, thinking faster, making decisions that other people's lives depended on in ways that most people would never fully understand unless they had stood in that operating room, under those lights, with someone's chest open in front of them in 30 seconds to figure out what was going wrong and why. She had saved a man's life that night. 34 years old, father of 3, had come in through the ER with internal bleeding that 2 other physicians had initially misread. Camille had taken one look at the imaging, said 4 words to her resident, and within 11 minutes was doing what needed to be done. The man's wife had been in the waiting room. She wouldn't know until much later how close it had been. Camille preferred it that way. That was the shift she was coming home from when she pulled into her own driveway on Aldercrest Drive, the house she and Raymond had bought 11 years ago, the house with the rose bushes she'd planted herself along the front walk, the house where the porch light was on because it was always on when she came home late, a habit Raymond had started in the first year of their marriage and never stopped. She sat in the car for 4 minutes after parking. Not because anything was wrong. Not because she was watching for something. She sat because Raymond had called during her drive home and they'd been in the middle of a conversation about nothing in particular. His flight back from D.C., whether they needed more coffee, something funny a junior agent had done at the office, and she'd wanted to finish the call before going inside rather than carry the phone through the garage. She had told him she was home. He had said the red heart he always said. She had smiled at her phone in the dark of the car and then set it in her bag and reached for the water bottle and the bag of plantain chips she had bought at the gas station on Reeve Street because she had been craving them since the previous Saturday and had kept forgetting to buy them. She was thinking about nothing more significant than those plantain chips when the cruiser pulled up. It didn't slow down the way police cars do when they're just passing through. It came in with intention, angling to block the street in front of her driveway, lights cutting on immediately, blue and white strobing across the front of the house and the neighbors' windows and the roses along the front walk. The kind of arrival designed to announce itself. To make a statement before a single word had been spoken. Camille looked at the cruiser. She set the plantain chips on the passenger seat. And she got out of the car. Later, people would ask her why she got out instead of staying in the vehicle. The answer was simple and she gave it the same way every time. Because it was her driveway. Because the car was parked. Because she had done nothing wrong and she understood, in the particular way that black women in America develop an understanding of certain things whether they want to or not, that the worst thing she could do was appear to be hiding. So she got out. She stood in her own driveway in her scrubs and her open jacket and she waited. In a car parked along the curb 40 feet away, a 26-year-old nursing student named Janelle Okafor had been sitting with her clinical notes spread across the passenger seat, running practice questions for an exam she had in 2 days. She had parked on Aldercrest because it was quiet and she studied better when she wasn't at home where her roommate watched television at a volume that she had given up asking about. Janelle looked up when the cruiser pulled in. She watched Camille get out of the car. She watched the officer approach. And something, not a thought exactly, more like a signal from somewhere deeper than thought, made her reach for her phone and press record before anything had even happened yet. She would later say she couldn't explain exactly why she did it so fast. That it was just something she knew. The officer's name was Derek Pruitt. He had been on the Hargrove Police Department for 22 years. He had commendations in his file and complaints in his file, and the commendations had been celebrated and the complaints had been processed and closed and filed away in a drawer that nobody opened unless they had to. He was 47 years old and he had been passed over for sergeant the previous spring, passed over for a woman 10 years younger than him with half his time on the force, which was something he had not said out loud at work but had said plenty of other places. He had been in a particular kind of mood for several months. The kind of mood that looks for somewhere to go. He had been dispatched in response to a call about a suspicious vehicle on Aldercrest Drive. A neighbor had reported an unfamiliar dark SUV sitting in a driveway on the block. Had not identified the driveway specifically. Had described the vehicle as just sitting there, with someone inside. Pruitt had not asked which driveway. Had not asked how long the vehicle had been there. Had not asked if the caller knew whose house it was. He had taken the call and driven to the street and seen the dark SUV and seen the black woman standing beside it and had made a series of decisions in the span of about 4 seconds that would end up costing him everything he had spent 22 years building. He did not introduce himself when he approached her. He did not explain why he was there. He walked toward her with the full weight of his certainty already in place, and he asked her what she was doing there. And Camille Weston-Hayes, who had been on her feet for 14 hours and had just saved a man's life and wanted nothing more than to eat her plantain chips and take a shower and sleep, looked at Officer Derek Pruitt and said, with perfect composure, that she lived there. That was where it started. People on the block would later describe the next few minutes in the particular fragmented way that witnesses describe things they watched through windows and from porches. Incomplete, overlapping, shaded by their own discomfort at having watched and not acted. 2 teenagers on bikes who had stopped pedaling and just stood there straddling their handlebars. A man on his porch who had checked his phone 3 times without looking at it. Someone's curtain moving in an upstairs window. Nobody came outside. Nobody said anything. Janelle kept recording. Camille had lived on Aldercrest Drive for 11 years. She knew the names of 6 of her neighbors and had waved to most of the rest. She had shoveled the walkway of the elderly woman 3 doors down after the big snow 2 winters ago. She had a rose bush that bloomed every June that 2 different neighbors had complimented unprompted. She paid her property taxes. She came home late sometimes because surgery does not keep office hours. She stood in the driveway of the house she owned and she answered every question Officer Pruitt put to her, and she asked one question of her own, and she asked it every time he tried to move past it. What is the legal basis for this detention? He never answered it. Not once. He asked her for identification. She asked if she was being detained. He said she was being difficult. She said she was being precise, and could he please clarify whether she was being detained, because the answer to that question would determine what she was and was not required to provide. Pruitt had been a police officer for 22 years. He had encountered all kinds of people in all kinds of situations. He had dealt with people who were angry and people who were frightened and people who were drunk and people who were dangerous and people who cried and people who ran and people who argued. He had a mental category for all of those responses. He knew what to do with each of them. He did not have a mental category for Camille Weston-Hayes. She was not angry. She was not afraid. She was not trying to argue or escalate or perform for anyone watching. She was simply standing in her own driveway being exactly as precise as she said she was being, and it was doing something to him that he couldn't name and didn't examine. A slow heat behind his sternum that was building the way pressure builds in a sealed container, looking for any available release point. He told her she was being detained for investigation. She said, calmly, investigation of what? He said she had been reported as suspicious. She said that being reported as suspicious is not a crime and does not constitute reasonable suspicion under the Fourth Amendment, and she asked again, what specific, articulable facts supported the belief that she had committed or was about to commit a crime? He stared at her. Later, Janelle would say that this was the moment she knew how the night was going to go. Not because of anything Camille did. Because of what she saw move across Pruitt's face in that silence. Something that looked like being caught, and then something that looked like deciding not to care that he'd been caught. Camille produced her ID. She held it out steadily, the way you hold something out when you want it to be absolutely clear that you are cooperating, that you are doing everything that is being asked of you, that the record will show you were cooperative from the very beginning. Her driver's license. Camille A. Weston-Hayes. Address: 14 Aldercrest Drive, Hargrove. The address on the license matched the address on the mailbox 3 feet to Pruitt's left. He took the license. He studied it for a long time, longer than any piece of identification requires to be read. The kind of looking that is not about gathering information but about making a point. About making someone stand and wait and feel the weight of being made to wait. He handed it back. She thought it was done. She reached for her bag. He said, "Fine. But you were sitting in that car for several minutes before you got out." She looked at him. She said she had been finishing a phone call. He said, "At this hour?" She said she was a surgeon. That she kept unusual hours. That she had just come from a 14-hour shift at Hargrove Regional Medical Center. He said, "You got proof of that?" And this was the moment, this specific moment, standing in her own driveway at 9:51 on a Tuesday night in her scrubs, being asked to prove that she was who she said she was in the place where she lived. This was the moment that something old and deeply familiar moved through Camille Weston-Hayes like a current. 19 years ago, when she was at a college parking lot, late at night, studying for her organic chemistry exam in the car because the library had closed and her roommate was asleep and she needed somewhere quiet. A campus officer who had knocked on her window and asked what she was doing there. She had explained. He had not believed her. He had asked her to get out of the car. He had asked for her student ID and then asked for a second form of ID as though the first one proved nothing. He had made her stand there in the cold while he called the campus security desk to verify that she was, in fact, a registered student at the university she had told him she attended. Her mother had always said, "Be twice as prepared, twice as calm, twice as clear." Her mother had said it the way people say things that they know from experience, the kind of experience you don't get to choose. Camille had cried in her car for an hour after that campus officer finally let her go. And then she had made a decision, not a dramatic one, not a moment of declared defiance, just a quiet, private, absolute decision that she would never again be in a situation where she didn't know exactly what her rights were and exactly how to articulate them. She had taken 1 year of law school before pivoting to medicine. She had never stopped reading. She pulled her hospital ID badge from the lanyard in her bag and held it out. Pruitt glanced at it. He said, "Anyone can get one of those printed." The goalposts had now moved 3 times in 6 minutes. She had provided a driver's license with a matching address. She had explained her profession. She had shown her hospital credentials. Each piece of evidence had been acknowledged and immediately replaced with a new requirement. This was not an investigation. This was a performance of authority that had no intention of ending in her favor regardless of what she produced. Camille understood this. She had understood it from approximately the second minute of the encounter. She had kept answering anyway because she also understood something else. She was not the only one for whom this record was being kept. She said, "I have lived at this address for 11 years. I can show you the deed of ownership on my phone. I can give you the name and number of 6 neighbors on this block. I can give you the name of the HOA contact who has had my phone number since 2014. What would you like?" Pruitt called in a request to run her plates. She said, "Am I free to go inside while you do that?" He said, "Stay where you are." She said, "Am I being detained?" He said, "I need you to calm down." She had not raised her voice. She had not moved aggressively. She had not used a single word that could be characterized as threatening or hostile. She had been standing in the same spot, in the same posture, speaking in the same measured register for nearly 8 minutes. She said, "I am calm. Am I being detained, yes or no?" Pruitt stepped toward her. She did not step back. He was close enough now that she could see the set of his jaw, the particular expression of a man who has confused being challenged with being disrespected, who has spent enough years in an institution that affirms his authority that the experience of that authority being questioned feels like an attack. He had never had to develop the vocabulary for what was happening in front of him, because the institution had never required it of him. He said, "I'm going to need you to." She said, "Do not touch me." He touched her. He grabbed her left arm above the elbow with enough force that she would have a bruise there by morning. He turned her toward the hood of the car, his other hand going to her shoulder, and Camille Weston-Hayes, who had never been arrested, who had no record, who was standing in her own driveway at 9:53 p.m., was pressed against her own vehicle by a man whose name she still did not know because he had never introduced himself. She said clearly at a volume that carried, "I am not resisting. I am on my own property. My hands are visible. I'm not resisting." She said it the way she had been trained by experience to say it, not frantically, not for him, but for the record. For whatever record existed. For Janelle's phone, which she had seen and which she suspected was still recording, though she couldn't be certain. She said, "This is being recorded." Pruitt looked up. He scanned the street. Saw Janelle's car. Couldn't tell in the dark whether she was filming or not. And something in him that might have been caution in a different man became, in him, something angrier. 40 feet away in the parked car, Janelle had stopped breathing in any way she was aware of. Her hands were completely still. She had the phone braced against the inside of the window frame, recording, and she was thinking with absolute clarity, "Do not move, do not lower the phone, do not make a sound. Just let it record." The man on the porch had gone inside. The two teenagers on bikes had ridden away without looking back. The curtain in the upstairs window had gone still. Sergeant Diane Cross arrived 4 minutes later. She pulled up behind Pruitt's cruiser, got out, and walked toward the driveway. She was 15 years on the force, experienced enough to read a scene quickly, the kind of officer who took her job seriously in the specific way that sometimes makes the job harder rather than easier, because she was not able to look at a thing and simply not see it. Pruitt met her at the edge of the driveway. He spoke first, quietly, quickly, and the words he used were, "Suspicious person, uncooperative, refused to identify, was acting erratically prior to your arrival." Cross looked past him at Camille. Camille was standing against her car. Her hospital badge was visible. Her hands were at her sides. Her expression was the expression of someone who had moved past the specific acute phase of a crisis and into the longer, harder work of enduring it without breaking. Cross looked at Pruitt. Then she looked at Camille again. Something moved across her face that Pruitt didn't notice because he wasn't watching her face. He was watching the street, still thinking about the car at the curb, still recalculating what it meant that someone might have been filming. Cross said, "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened?" And Camille, for the first time in the encounter, felt the particular specific exhaustion of being asked to explain what happened to the person who was supposed to make it stop happening, of being required to perform composure and clarity and cooperation for yet another authority figure who had arrived at a scene already framed against her, who was starting from the premise that there were two sides and that the person who called for backup got to define the center. She took a breath. And she told her. Cross asked her questions with the tone of someone who was trying to be fair and couldn't entirely get there. The questions themselves were reasonable. The angle of them was not. There was a particular inflection, subtle, probably not even fully conscious, that presumed she was accounting for herself rather than describing what had been done to her. The difference is small enough that most people would miss it. Camille did not miss it. She had a medical degree and a year of law school and 44 years of living in a body that other people made constant assumptions about, and she could hear the difference between being interviewed as a victim and being interviewed as a suspect with a story to tell. She answered every question. Her name. Her address. How long she had lived there. What she did for work. Why she had been sitting in the car. Where she had been before coming home. Whether she had any documentation. She had documentation for everything except the last 11 years of her life in this house, which she had also offered and which Cross had not yet reached. She produced her driver's license again. Her hospital ID. She opened her phone and pulled up the property deed. She kept it in a folder in her cloud storage along with her insurance documents and her car registration, the kind of organizational habit that her mother had instilled in her and that she had maintained for reasons she understood better now than she had when she first started doing it. Cross looked at it carefully. Longer than Pruitt had looked at anything. Cross was doing her job. Pruitt, standing 6 feet away, said, "She was acting erratically before you arrived." Camille said, "Sergeant asked the neighbors. I have lived here for 11 years. It was 10:04 p.m. She had been in her driveway for 17 minutes. The sprinklers across the street had finally shut off. Cross got on her radio. She ran the address. She ran the plates. She called dispatch and had them run the property record through the county assessor's database, which was not something that was strictly required of her but which Cross did because she was the kind of officer who, when something didn't add up, kept adding. Pruitt watched her do this with an expression that had gone very still and very careful, the expression of someone monitoring a situation that is beginning to develop characteristics they had not anticipated. The database confirmed it. 14 Aldercrest Drive. Owners of record, Camille A. Weston-Hayes and Raymond D. Hayes. Purchase date, March 2013. Cross called the HOA contact number listed in the property record. It was 10:09 p.m. The man who answered was named Gerald Whitmore, and he was the HOA treasurer and had been for 4 years, and when Cross explained why she was calling, there was a pause on his end of the line and then he said, "Yes, Camille Hayes lived at that address, had lived there since before he joined the HOA board. had attended 3 neighborhood meetings that he could remember, and had once brought a very good sweet potato pie to the block party in 2019. Cross thanked him and ended the call. She stood in the driveway for a moment with her radio in her hand and Pruitt on her left and Camille on her right, and the arithmetic of the situation was not complicated. Everything Camille had said was accurate. Everything Pruitt had characterized as suspicious had a straightforward, ordinary, completely innocent explanation. The car in the driveway was her car. The house behind her was her house. The hospital ID around her neck was her hospital ID. The woman that a neighbor had called to report as suspicious was, in fact, the resident. Pruitt said, she was still acting in a manner that warranted investigation. Cross looked at him. She didn't say anything right away. She was choosing her words with the care of someone who is doing 2 things at the same time, trying to be accurate and trying to manage a situation that she can see is already worse than it needed to be, that she is now partially implicated in simply by virtue of having arrived. She had not put hands on Camille Weston-Hayes. She had not called her uncooperative or dismissed her documentation. But she had arrived on a call that Pruitt had framed, and she had asked her initial questions through that frame, and she knew it. Pruitt said, she was uncooperative with a lawful investigation. Camille said, there was no lawful basis for the investigation in the first place. He said, you were reported as suspicious. She said, a neighbor reporting a car in a driveway is not probable cause and is not reasonable suspicion. You know that. I know that. And I want to be very clear that I know that. Pruitt looked at her with an expression that had finished recalculating and arrived somewhere cold. He was not going to apologize. He was not going to acknowledge what Cross had just confirmed. He was going to go back to his cruiser and he was going to file a report, and in that report he was going to use language that he had used before in situations that had gone sideways on him, language designed to make the other person's behavior seem threatening, seem erratic, seem like the kind of behavior that warranted the response it received. He had done it before. The complaints had been filed and processed and closed. He had been through this before and he was still here. He did not know about the phone in the car at the curb. He did not know about Janelle. Cross approached Camille. She said, ma'am, everything checks out. You're free to go inside. Camille said, I was always free to go inside. Cross had no answer for that. It was not a statement that had an answer. It was simply true, the way some true things are both completely obvious and completely devastating at the same time. Camille Weston-Hayes had been free to go inside her own home at 9:44 when she pulled into her own driveway, and for the 27 minutes since then she had been detained without legal basis, questioned without cause, and physically grabbed in her own driveway by a man who still had not told her his name. Cross said nothing. Pruitt went back to his cruiser. Cross stood in the driveway for another few seconds, and in those few seconds she was doing the specific kind of thinking that happens when you are a person who takes your job seriously and you are standing at an intersection between institutional loyalty and the plain evidence of your own eyes. She had 15 years on the Hargrove PD. She had colleagues. She had a pension she was 8 years from. She had a way of moving through the institution that required her to be careful about when and how she created friction. She was thinking about all of that. She was also thinking about the property deed on Camille's phone, the HOA treasurer's voice, the hospital badge, the bruise that was going to be visible by morning on Camille's left arm. She went back to her cruiser. She did not go home. She drove to a parking lot 3 blocks away and sat in her car for 22 minutes. She was not on a call. She was not responding to anything. She was sitting in a parking lot at 10:31 p.m. on a Tuesday night and thinking about what she had seen and what it meant and what, if anything, she was going to do about it. She did not sign off on Pruitt's incident report that night. She told herself she would deal with it in the morning, that she needed to think, that there were processes for this kind of thing and she needed to follow the processes rather than act on impulse. She told herself that. She went home and did not sleep. Pruitt filed his report at 11:17 p.m. from his cruiser. The language he chose was careful. A suspicious person had been reported at the address. The individual had been initially uncooperative and had failed to provide identification promptly. The individual had been verbally aggressive and had made statements that the officer perceived as threatening. The individual had subsequently provided documentation that confirmed residency and the investigation had been closed. No further action recommended. He read it back to himself once. It was, in its way, a professional piece of work. Every word technically defensible. Every word designed to make what Camille had done seem problematic and what he had done seem reasonable. He had been writing reports like this for 22 years and he was good at it. He sent it. He went home. He slept. Janelle waited until Cross's cruiser was gone. Then she waited another 5 minutes, watching the street, watching Pruitt's cruiser, watching the driveway where Camille was still standing. And then she got out of her car. She walked up the driveway. She said she was sorry to bother her. She said she didn't know if it would be useful, but she had been parked on the street studying, and she had recorded it on her phone, and she wanted Camille to see it before she decided what she wanted to do. Camille looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Show me." Janelle handed her the phone. The footage was everything. It was 4 minutes and 38 seconds, shot from inside the car through the passenger window with the phone braced against the window frame, and the angle was imperfect but the content was not. You could see Camille presenting her license. You could see Pruitt's body language shifting each time she answered a question. The incremental, almost rhythmic quality of the goalpost moving, the way each piece of evidence was dismissed not with reasoning but with replacement. You could see Camille standing still and straight and completely calm while being questioned in her own driveway. You could see Pruitt step into her space. You could hear Camille say, "Do not touch me." You could see him touch her anyway, and you could see the grab, not ambiguous, not gentle, not something that could be characterized as a guiding hand. You could hear Camille's voice, clear and steady, "I am not resisting. I am on my own property. This is being recorded." And you could hear, in the background of all of it, the sprinklers running across the street. Camille watched it without expression. She watched it twice. Then she handed the phone back to Janelle and said, "Can you send me that?" Janelle sent it. Camille took her number. She said thank you in the specific way that people say thank you when they mean something layered by it. Gratitude, yes, but also something about being seen. Something about the act of a stranger in a parked car deciding that what she was watching mattered enough to record. Something about not having been completely alone in the driveway even when it had felt that way. Janelle went back to her car. She sat there for a while before she drove away. She would later say she didn't know if she had done the right thing or just the necessary thing, and that she had learned enough in her nursing program already to know that those are not always the same thing. Camille went inside. She stood in her kitchen in her scrubs with her bag still on her shoulder. The house was quiet. Raymond was in D.C., wouldn't be home until the weekend unless his schedule changed, which it did sometimes with no warning because that was the nature of the work. The kitchen light was the particular yellow-white that kitchen lights are at night, too bright for the hour, too ordinary for the occasion. The plantain chips were still in her bag. She set her bag down. She sat at the kitchen table. She did not eat the chips. She did not take off her jacket. She did not do any of the quiet, familiar things she normally did when she came home from a long shift. The specific decompression ritual of a person whose days required her to hold so much and who had learned to let it go carefully, in stages, so that it didn't take her with it. She sat at the kitchen table and she looked at the countertop and she was very still. She had been through this before. Not this exactly. Not with this outcome. But the shape of it, the particular architecture of being required to justify your presence, to prove you belong somewhere that you have every right to be, to perform docility and cooperation and non-threat for someone who has already decided what you are. She knew that shape. It had a particular weight and she knew where it settled in her body and she knew how long it would take to move through. She picked up her phone. She called Raymond. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was still up, probably at his desk the way he was at his desk until late on the nights she wasn't home to make him stop working. He said her name the way he said it when he knew from the sound of the line that something had happened. She told him. She told him everything in order, precisely, without editorializing or minimizing or performing any kind of composure she didn't actually feel, because this was Raymond, and with Raymond she didn't have to perform anything. She told him about the cruiser and Pruitt and the ID and the hospital badge and the 3 times the goalposts moved and the grab and the words she had said out loud so the record would have them and Cross arriving and the HOA treasurer and Janelle and the footage. Raymond did not interrupt her. He listened to everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the particular way he was quiet when he was not processing something emotionally but analytically, moving it into categories, understanding its shape. He had worked in the FBI Civil Rights Division for 19 years. He had investigated cases involving use of force under color of law. He had interviewed officers and chiefs and attorneys and oversight boards and victims in cities all over the country. He had developed, over 19 years, a very precise understanding of how these situations moved. The patterns of escalation, the patterns of institutional response, the points at which documentation became critical, the difference between a case that resolved in a week and a case that dragged through bureaucracy for years. He asked 3 questions. He asked, "Does Cross know you have the footage?" She said no. He asked, "What did Pruitt's report say if you know?" She said, "I don't know yet." He asked, "Is Janelle willing to talk to someone official if it comes to that?" She said, "I believe so." Yes. He said, "Send me the footage. Don't call anyone else tonight. I'll be home by morning." She said, "Raymond." He said, "Camille. I've got it." She knew what that meant. She had heard him say it before in a handful of situations over their 18 years, always in the same tone. Not a reassurance, not a promise that things would be easy or fast or clean, but a statement of intention from a man who meant what he said in a way that was very specific and very reliable. "I've got it meant. I understand what this is and I know what to do with it and you don't have to carry it alone." She sent him the footage. She went upstairs. She did not sleep for a long time. Raymond ended the call, sat at his desk in DC and watched the footage 3 times. Then he watched it a 4th time, slower, the way he watched evidence. He noted the timestamp. He noted the specific moment of physical contact. He noted the language of Pruitt's approach and the language of Camille's responses and the 4 minutes and 38 seconds of clean, audio intact, timestamp documentation that showed unambiguously what had happened on Aldercrest Drive at 9:53 p.m. on a Tuesday. He called his supervisor at 11:45 p.m. His supervisor answered because Raymond did not call at 11:45 p.m. unless there was a reason. Raymond explained the situation in the same precise, analytical register that he used for everything professional, neither more nor less urgent than the facts warranted, which was already quite urgent enough. He mentioned the address. He mentioned Pruitt's name. He mentioned that Cross had been on scene and had run proper verification and had not signed off on the incident report. He mentioned the footage. His supervisor said, "Get on a plane." Raymond booked a 5 a.m. flight. He sat at his desk for another hour before he left for the airport. He was not doing anything dramatic. He was not making calls he shouldn't make or using authority he didn't have. He was, very methodically, doing his job, the job he had been doing for 19 years, which was identifying situations where the law had been broken by the people who were supposed to enforce it and making sure that the mechanisms that existed to address that actually functioned. He had worked on cases in 14 states. He had testified in federal court 11 times. He had seen departments reform and departments double down and departments collapse and departments do the absolute minimum required to make a problem look like it had been addressed without actually addressing it. He knew which kind Hargrove was going to be. He didn't know yet, but he was going to find out. He got on the plane. Meanwhile, in Hargrove, Sergeant Diane Cross was lying in the dark in her bedroom at 12:30 a.m., and she was not sleeping, and she was thinking about the incident report she had not signed, and she was thinking about 15 years, and she was thinking about a woman pressed against a car in her own driveway, and she was thinking about her own mother, who was 68 and who lived alone in a house she had owned for 30 years in a neighborhood that had changed around her, and who had called Diane twice in the past 2 years to tell her about police encounters with neighbors that had made her feel unsafe in a place she had lived for 3 decades. Cross stared at the ceiling. Pruitt was already asleep. Raymond Hayes arrived at 14 Aldercrest Drive at 6:04 a.m. Camille was at the kitchen table with coffee. She hadn't moved far from that table in the hours since she'd sat down. She heard his key in the door and she heard him set his bag down in the hall and she heard his footsteps and then he was in the kitchen doorway in his coat, still in his DC clothes, carry-on bag in the hall behind him. He sat down across from her. She pushed the second mug toward him. He watched the footage again there at the kitchen table on her phone. 4 times. She watched him watch it. The particular stillness of a man who is not suppressing an emotional reaction but genuinely, professionally processing information, filing it into the correct categories, understanding the precise shape of what it means. When he set the phone down, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just for a moment. Just that. Then he got up, went upstairs and came back down in a suit. She said, "You don't have to do this today." He said, "Yes, I do." He drove to the Hargrove Police Department at 7:40 a.m., before the administrative shift fully turned over, before the people who would need to manage this situation had had time to get ahead of it. He did not call ahead. He did not alert the department. He did not give anyone time to prepare a response, because he understood that preparation in situations like this one meant the arrangement of narratives rather than the arrangement of facts. He walked in. He presented his credentials to the desk sergeant. He said he needed to speak with the chief. The desk sergeant looked at the credentials, looked up, looked at the credentials again. He said, "One moment, sir." He made a phone call. Then he made another one. It took 11 minutes for Chief Gary Beaumont to come to the front of the building, which was about 10 minutes longer than it should have taken given the circumstances. He was a man in his early 60s who had run the Hargrove PD for 9 years and who had a particular way of entering a room that telegraphed his preferred approach to difficult situations. Broad, affable, hands slightly out, the posture of someone who resolves things by turning them into smaller things. He extended his hand to Raymond. He said, "Agent Hayes, what can I do for you this morning?" Raymond shook his hand. He said, "I'd like to speak privately." They went to the chief's office. Raymond sat down, opened his briefcase, and placed a single printed document on the desk, a time-stamped transcript of the footage supplemented by the audio. He had prepared it at 3 a.m. in his D.C. apartment before getting in the car for the airport. He said, "At 9:47 p.m. last night, your officer, Derek Pruitt, badge number 4471, responded to a call at 14 Aldercrest Drive. The resident, who is my wife, was detained without reasonable suspicion, subjected to use of force without probable cause, and had her documentation systematically dismissed in a pattern consistent with bias-based policing. This was captured on video with clear audio." The incident report filed by Officer Pruitt at 11:17 p.m. characterizes the interaction in a manner that is materially inconsistent with the documented record. The chief said, "I understand this is personal for you, Agent Hayes, and I completely." Raymond said, "The footage documents an unlawful detention, use of force without probable cause, and a false incident report. Those are federal concerns. Whatever internal process you choose to run is entirely within your discretion. But the federal review is already open as of 11:58 last night. I want to make sure you have that information clearly." The chief's affability did not disappear exactly. It shifted. It became the affability of someone recalculating. He called his legal counsel. It took 40 minutes for the department's attorney to arrive. During those 40 minutes, Raymond sat in a chair in the waiting area with a cup of coffee he had been offered and had accepted and drank without reading anything or checking his phone. He was not impatient. Impatience was not a tool he used. He had 19 years of experience sitting in waiting areas while institutions got themselves organized to respond to things they hadn't anticipated and hadn't prepared for, and he had learned that the waiting itself was information. What people did in it, how long it took them, who they called first. The attorney arrived. They went back into the chief's office. The chief had, in the 40 minutes of waiting, made a decision. It was not the right decision, but it was the predictable one. The first decision that institutional self-protection generates when it encounters an unexpected threat. He offered a private resolution, a formal internal review, a letter of apology to Camille Pruitt to receive a reprimand and additional training. Raymond listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "The footage has been preserved and documented with the DOJ Civil Rights Division. There will be a federal review regardless of the internal process. What I'm asking you to consider is what cooperation with that review looks like versus what resistance to it looks like. Those are two very different experiences for a department." The attorney started to say something. Raymond said, "I also want to note that Sergeant Cross did not sign off on the incident report filed last night." The room got quiet. The chief looked at his attorney. Cross had been called in at 8 a.m., before Raymond had arrived, in what appeared to have been an effort to get the department's story aligned before anyone asked any questions. She had arrived, sat down across from a supervisor she trusted slightly less than she trusted her own judgment, and been asked to walk through the events of the previous night. She had told the truth. Not performed truth, actual truth. The kind that doesn't require management or maintenance, that doesn't leave gaps you have to remember to fill in the same way each time. She told it in order. She had arrived on scene, Pruitt had briefed her, she had conducted her own verification. The verification had confirmed the resident's account in full, and the resident had been free to go. She said that she had reviewed Pruitt's incident report and found the language to be inconsistent with her own observations of the scene, which was why she had not signed it. When they asked her why she hadn't flagged it the previous night, She said she had wanted to think about how to handle it properly. When they asked her what she meant by that, she said she had wanted to make sure she was describing what she had seen accurately and not reacting to something she had only partially processed. When they asked her if she stood by that account, she said yes. She said it without hesitation. The investigation moved. Pruitt was called in at 10:15 a.m. He arrived in his uniform, which was already a kind of statement, already the posture of a man who expected to be defended. He sat across from the chief and the department attorney, and he began from the first sentence to tell the version of the night that his incident report had constructed. The suspicious vehicle, the uncooperative subject, the erratic behavior, the standard investigation, the resolution. The chief's attorney slid a printed still from the footage across the table. The still showed Pruitt's hand on Camille's arm at the moment of contact. Pruitt looked at it. He said, "That doesn't show what you think it shows." The attorney slid the transcript of the audio across next. Pruitt said she was threatening to. The attorney pointed to the specific lines of the transcript. Pruitt stopped talking. He was suspended with pay that afternoon, pending investigation. His union representative arrived at 2 p.m., the particular brand of institutional reflex that arrives with documentation and talking points and the practiced composure of someone who has done this before. The union rep was competent and familiar with the process and made all the appropriate arguments about due process and officer safety and the importance of not making judgments before investigations were complete. The Federal Review did not pause for those arguments. Pruitt's personnel file was pulled as part of the review. The investigators found 14 prior complaints. 12 had been closed without substantive action. The remaining 2 had resulted in letters placed in his file. Letters that noted the concerns and recommended training and did nothing further. Of the 12 closed complaints, 2 had been filed by black residents in neighborhoods that overlapped with the area around Aldercrest Drive. 1 had been filed by a black man who had been asked to prove he owned the car he was sitting in. 1 had been filed by a black woman who had been detained in a grocery store parking lot while loading her car. Both cases had been closed. Both complainants had been interviewed once and not followed up with. The pattern was not subtle. It was the kind of pattern that had been invisible because nobody had looked at the whole file all at once. Now someone was looking. Pruitt was suspended without pay 6 weeks into the investigation. His union rep filed a grievance. The grievance was processed. The investigation continued. The criminal referral came 11 weeks after the incident on Aldercrest Drive. Assault under color of law. Filing a false police report. 2 federal charges, clear evidentiary support, Janelle's footage as the spine of the documentation. Janelle had said yes immediately when she was asked to cooperate with the investigation. She had said it the way she had reached for her phone in the car that night, without hesitation, as though the decision had already been made somewhere she couldn't fully access and was just waiting to be confirmed. She had given her footage. She had given a formal statement. She had sat across from investigators and described, clearly and in detail, exactly what she had seen from 40 feet away in a parked car while she was supposed to be studying for a clinical exam. She was 26 years old and she had never given testimony before, and she had been nervous in the way that people are nervous when they understand the stakes of something. But her account did not waver. It did not have the gaps that invented accounts have. It held together because it was simply what had happened, and what had happened was on video, and the video was what it was. The case went to trial 8 months after the night on Aldercrest Drive. Pruitt sat at the defense table in civilian clothes, which his attorney had advised and which made him look, somehow, both more ordinary and more diminished than his uniform ever had. 22 years of commendations and a department that had protected him through 14 complaints and a union that had filed every available motion, and it had come to this. A federal courtroom, a jury of 12 people, and 4 minutes and 38 seconds of footage that the prosecution played without commentary and let stand on its own. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. The verdict was guilty on both counts. Pruitt did not look at Camille when it was read. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 18 months in federal prison. Loss of pension. Permanent decertification. The 22-year career ended in a courtroom on a Thursday morning in October. The Hargrove Police Department, facing both federal pressure and the public weight of the footage that had circulated widely after the trial, announced a series of reforms. Mandatory bias training, not the one-day kind, the ongoing kind with external oversight. A new use of force review process. And the Civilian Oversight Board that had been proposed 3 separate times in the past 6 years and blocked each time by the department and the union, the board that had never been allowed to exist, was established, fully funded, with subpoena power. It took the entire thing, all of it, the footage, the federal charges, the trial, the verdict, to make the board happen. That was the part that Camille sat with for a long time. That it took all of that to do a thing that should have been done 6 years earlier. That the board existed now because of what had happened to her, which meant that the women before her, the man in the parking lot with his car, the woman in the grocery store lot, they hadn't been enough. The complaints hadn't been enough. The closed files in the drawer hadn't been enough. It had taken a surgeon with a lawyer's knowledge of her rights and a nursing student with a phone and a federal agent with a briefcase and 19 years of experience for the thing that should have been a baseline to finally happen. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went back to work. It was the Monday after the verdict. She was in the OR by 7 a.m., in the particular focused stillness of the space she trusted most. The space where what she knew translated directly into what she did, where the stakes were clear, where her hands were the thing that mattered. She did a 14-hour shift. She saved a life. She came home. Raymond was cooking. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and just looked at him, this man who had gotten on a plane at 5 a.m. with a briefcase and his credentials and 19 years of doing the right thing in the specific, unglamorous way that doing the right thing usually actually looks like, which is documentation and process and sitting in waiting rooms and making phone calls at 11:45 p.m. She sat at the kitchen table. He put a plate in front of her. She opened her bag and found the plantain chips, still there since Tuesday 8 months ago, obviously long past eating. She looked at them. She put them on the table. She and Raymond looked at the plantain chips. Then they both slowly started laughing. Not at the chips. Not really. She didn't need the world to know who she was. She had never needed that. She had needed, that night in her driveway, exactly one thing. One person with authority over what was happening to have a reason to apply that authority correctly. And sometimes the mechanism that delivers that is a nursing student with a phone and a steady hand. And sometimes it is a husband on a red eye with a briefcase and a door he knows how to open. And sometimes it is a sergeant who couldn't sleep and didn't sign a report and told the truth in the morning. The law, it turned out, did apply to everyone. It had just needed a little help getting there. Sergeant Cross was the quiet turning point of this entire story. She didn't sign the report. She told the truth. No one made her do either of those things. What do you think it costs a person to do that, and what does it cost them not to? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of something you've seen or lived, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And leave a comment, because the conversation that happens in this community is part of what makes it worth building.